This is the SIG Auth call for Wednesday, April 5th, 2017. Had a pretty full agenda, so we'll get started and then we'll see if we have any time left at the end for open topics. So I wanted to highlight a few pull requests and issues that are tagged with our SIG. I've been trying to be sure to add that tag. So if you're watching issues or pull requests and filter it to SIG Auth, that should give a pretty good picture of what's going on, at least in the main repo. And if you see issues or PRs that don't have that tag, add it or mention the SIG Auth team and we'll get that added. So there were a few here that wanted to get people's feedback on, and we can talk about it here, or you can jump into those issues and comment on them. The first is a role that Steve was looking at adding. There are some cluster level resources like storage classes that we expect to be used to let users discover what storage classes they can request in their persistent volume claims. And so there are other class type of resources that I think will be similar. And so we're wanting to come up with a role that will give read access to those things. And we're having trouble coming up with a good name for that role. So if you have ideas or you want to look at the pull request and add suggestions, maybe someone will come up with a better name. There were a couple of pod security policy pulls. There's one open to give finer grained control over host path or allowed host paths. So right now, pod security policy just lets you allow or disallow host path volumes. It's all or nothing. And so this would let you whitelist specific paths. Eric, did you want to talk about that? I know you had mentioned wanting that a while ago. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that. Eric, too.
I don't have any comments on that.
Okay. All right.
I would just say it sounds good to me.
Yeah, right. I think one of the tricky things about pod security policy is going to be figuring out how to structure like all the little options that might make sense for some volumes. Right now, this one is adding it sort of peer to the allowed volume list or about allowed volume type field. And I think it's going to be tricky to structure that in a way that's not ugly, but maybe ugly is okay. Anyway, the other pod security policy item in 1.6, you can authorize use of pod security policies cluster wide, and it has to be cluster wide. So if you have a policy that lets users create privileged pods, you can either let them do that anywhere in the cluster or nowhere in the cluster. And so this pull went in that would let you give users that permission just within a specific namespace. Now for those playing along at home, you would have to pair that with something that would limit which nodes you could target in that namespace, right? Otherwise, if you can create privileged pods within a particular namespace, if you can target them out to any node, then that really hasn't gotten you a lot. But when you combine it with some of the admission plugins that let you force pods in a namespace to only go onto nodes with specific selectors, then that becomes really powerful. You can you could limit a namespace to a set of nodes and then let users create privileged pods on those nodes. And once we subdivide nodes access back to the API, that can start to get you into like a tenant model where you say, you have these namespaces which go to these nodes and you can do whatever you want on those nodes.
Is there anything blocking that PR? Because last time I checked, it looks good to me. And this actually is basically, this is a requirement, at least for us, to use pod security policies. So we would.
Which one? The namespace one?
The namespace one, yeah.
No, it merged.
Oh, perfect. Never mind then.
So
I agree with
the
what
thing
Jordan said about it tying in with like partitioning nodes, but like we're still haven't gotten there as far as I know. So I think it's hard to hold it up based on that.
Right. Like this is a building block. We have like 3 dimensions of building blocks. You have controlling what kind of pods you can have in a namespace, controlling what nodes a namespace can target, and then controlling what that node can do back to the API. And all 3 of those pieces have to be there.
I feel feeling as those grow, we're going to end up with V2 of some of these APIs because there's no way we're going to get them all to converge at the first try.
Yeah. So yeah, Eric, the thing that's holding that up is 1.7.
Cool.
There's an old issue about enabling service account token lookup and revocation by default. So service account tokens are signed JWTs, and those signatures get verified by the API server. But by default, they don't expire. And by default, the API server doesn't look up whether they've been revoked. And JWT revocation is like a black hole that I don't want to get into. But the simple way to check that is to see if the secret where they were stored still exists. And there's an option to check that. And some deployments use it, some deployments don't. It was off by default in the initial implementation. And I've been wanting to turn it on for several releases now. I think the downsides would both be performance impact, which I'm not that concerned about because we've been running it at scale in lots of deployments, and the sort of distributed federation aspects where I want to use my service account tokens against another cluster based solely on the signatures, and where they don't share an SED and they can't do this lookup. My desire would be to turn it on by default, and for those sort of federated, I want to just go on the signature types of setups, they can turn it off. I think the principle of least surprise says if I delete a service account and all its tokens, I shouldn't be able to use those tokens anymore. There are other thoughts about that. If people want to think about it more, they can jump into those issues too. So.
How do we prevent these type of changes to default flags from creeping up on us once 1.7 gets released, and other SIGs come in and say, hey, you've changed default behavior? Is there like a better way we could communicate that up front so we could have that discussion now rather than right at 1.7?
For something like this where it's a default change, other than an announcement and doing it early in a release cycle so that we can run all our test scenarios with it the way we want it to be, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I mean, but even KubeUp last time was changed to RBAC really early in the release cycle. It was more just other SIGs being concerned. Let me follow up with some other people and figure out if there's a better way to announce it to the release team or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not to get back on that conversation because that was pretty different last time.
It's a good question. So probably those 3 concerns, I guess. Performance, sort of a federated signature only use case, and then just people expecting it to work the way it works today. Although honestly, I think people would be surprised if you told them that you can delete a service account and all its tokens and then keep using them. So,
yeah, definitely.
All right. Yeah, well, we'll continue the discussion in that poll. I did tag in SIG scalability. We do have KubeMark running against sort of a fully secured stack now, so that's good. So if there are issues with this, it should show up there. All right. The next poll I wanted to highlight, some folks were trying to use impersonation from kubectl. So for those who don't know, you can, if you have sufficient permissions, you can run kubectl commands as some other username, which is really handy for like testing out whether a particular user has permissions to do things, or what would happen if you ran an API call as that user. The impersonation filter was not including the authenticated group, which meant that permissions like discovery that we give to all authenticated users would fail if you actually ran that command with an empty discovery cache. So I don't think this is contentious, but it's open for review, and I wanted to call it out. The next one is actually a response for those who saw the pod security policy CVE announcement a couple weeks ago. We're going through the retrospective on that now. I'll probably send that out to the list in the next day or so. And one of the root causes for that was sort of special case handling of requests that came to the unsecured port. So currently, if you make a request to the unsecured port, the localhost 8080 port, there's no authentication and authorization on that port. And what that means is for the rest of the stack, the user info is nil. And so places where we check things against user info had the special case, like the nil use case. And that made for tricky logic in a couple places and incorrect logic in one place, and that caused that CVE. And so this PR is removing the special case handling. And if you make a request to the unsecured port, you get a super user assigned. And so everything else that deals with users can actually run authorization checks, and that user will pass all those checks, but they don't have the special case, the situation where there's no user info on the request. So special cases are bad. Let's not have special cases. There are a couple work in progress design pulls open. The threat model stuff is something we've been wanting to talk through for a while. So Clayton started that. It's early stages, so definitely take a look at that, comment. If there are things that you're expecting to see that aren't there, mention them. We want to make sure we are comprehensive, but also understandable. So we want to cover all the bases, and then if we want to drill deeper in some of those, we can maybe break those out to different sections or different docs. But we want kind of one place where people can look and see, oh, here's my network threats, here's my authenticated user threats, here's threats from the node, here's threats from containers, and just sort of hit all the bases and list the threats. So take a look at that. There's another one there, number 500, that Clayton opened, that is sort of half summarizing and half restating where we are in some of the pod security policy stuff. So yeah, that's sort of catching up with the last year of development and design work and trying to capture that. All right. That is the whirlwind through the issues and polls that I had that I wanted to mention.
Cool.
Do we want to talk about some of the client auth polls that are open, or did people have other things before we jump into those?
Thank you for triaging this.
Yeah. All right. Cole, did you want to talk through the Azure stuff? I know Eric had looked at it some, and I saw you commenting.
Yeah, sure.
On the call.
Yeah, so I'll give you guys my quick backstory on the whole Azure Auth plugin. I was looking at doing this originally in March, and we found some problems with the way that Active Directory issues ID tokens. Primarily, there's two versions of AAD. AAD v1 does not sign the ID tokens when they're refreshed. And AAD v2 has no device flow login, so there's no good way for us to have users get us a token, especially in cases where the browser and kubectl are not on the same actual machine. So what it looks like has happened is Cosmin went off and wrote an implementation that hosts access tokens from the Azure CLI to the OIDC plugin in the API server. I think both Eric and I have concerns about whether or not this is valid usage of OIDC and is secure in the first place. And I think that conversation is probably going to play out on GitHub, partly because Eric has a little bit better knowledge of this to push back on Cosmin than I do, and also may involve an internal thread on discussing this with AAD and seeing what they advise. Otherwise, I think this is somewhat similar to what y'all do for Google, where you guys have a plugin that calls out to gcloud to dump the config helper out and steal the access token from that. I realize on the back end you use webhook instead of OIDC, but it seems like the plugin model there's at least some precedent for. We just need to figure out if it's actually the right methodology to be using for the plugin.
Okay, I couldn't tell looking at it. Is there already like a configuration JSON file present on the machine that it's pulling information out of, or?
So it looks like there's two implementations. One is it will try to look into the Azure CLI directory and see if there's already an access token stored there, and if not, it will actually go ahead and initiate the device auth flow, whereby it will retrieve a token after prompting the user to take some action.
I see.
Yeah.
Is the device flow something that the Azure CLI will do on its own? Like, is there a way to delegate that to that and then just work from the token JSON?
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, so if you were already, if you're on your machine and you've already done AZ login, it does the device flow and it caches the access token. I think Cosmin was just writing the plugin to be a little more resilient and handle cases where the user hasn't already done that. Now, it's possible that instead of actually doing the device flow in Go code inside of the plugin, that it could install just like OS exec AZ login, but I'm not necessarily sure that is better than just doing the device flow auth in the plugin itself.
We've generally separated the thing that does the login from the thing that actually grabs the token. So like the way that the gcloud one works is that you use the gcloud tool to log in, and then kubectl just grabs it. And once that expires or whatever, then gcloud is the tool that actually does the refreshing of particular tokens.
Okay, so somewhere inside the plugin, you guys are OS execing like gcloud refresh or something, or if the access token is expired, do you just like spat an error message that says please go log in again with gcloud? Or
I don't know exactly. I would have to look at the exact thing, but the big point is that kubectl does not currently have any interactive sessions. There's no sort of precedence right now for it prompting you to say, go to this website and enter this access token, or hey, you need to log in. I'm going to it for you.
Okay.
So Cole, I can speak to how the gcloud one works.
Okay.
Actually, essentially does OS exec to give me an up-to-date access token based on the cached refresh token that gcloud manages.
Okay.
But that's an entirely non-interactive.
Non-interactive. So if you do revoke that refresh token, you're going to need a user interactive flow through gcloud in order to get a new refresh token.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that seems totally reasonable to me.
So the initial token can be delegated. Getting the initial token is delegated, but then refreshing it can be.
Yeah, I think we just throw an error like you're not logged in.
Right.
Please go log in using gcloud auth login.
Sure. Yeah. So I think then the thing for us to do is I don't think we have. Like we're not issuing if you look at his code today, he's not issuing a command to get the access token. He's just reaching directly into the cache. And so I think we would first need to go ahead and add CLI support to create the equivalent of your config helper that dumps out that information or / does the refresh and then dumps out that information. But it seems totally reasonable to me to push back on removing the interactive flow from the plugin as it's implemented now. I understand that concern. It makes sense to me.
Okay.
So I think I will give that feedback to Cosmin, and I'll probably go file a bug on the Azure CLI right now to see if they're willing to implement that. And then we need to sort through whether or not this implementation is sound. I think, Eric, it seems like you were echoing some of the concerns I had about the use of the access token in this fashion with OIDC.
Yeah, it seems like the access token happens to work with OIDC.
Yeah.
I'll do my best to sort of try to keep up with that thread and make sure and ask the right questions.
Okay.
The concern is that a little bit it seemed like the audience was global, but somehow now it's not. I'm a little confused. I need to catch back up on that thread that happened this morning.
Yeah, I'm a little confused myself. I think there's potential that this two things there. One is you can use URLs as client IDs in Azure, and so it's possible that is just the registered client ID for the Azure CLI. The other possibility is that I know at various points in time this client ID has had special permissions that other clients don't have, and so there may be some magic going on there that I don't even quite fully know about. So.
Okay.
All right. So Cole and Eric, if you can,
we can follow up.
It sounds like you guys have it in hand. That'd be great.
Sure.
Appreciate it. There was one other client auth plugin that has actually been open for a little while, which is an OpenStack one, and this was kind of along the lines of what I was expecting the Azure one to be as well, which is like making use of known environment variables or files that are present in an environment that is authenticated to this provider. So when you are authenticated to OpenStack, these environment variables are part of like the standard shell environment. And so this is taking advantage of those to obtain a token for kubectl to use. This is dependent on an OpenStack token authenticator, which is another pull that's been open for a while, and I think I would actually like to see moved out to a webhook implementation rather than adding natively, at least to begin with, just because there's some questions about what the right mapping is. But I think this is a good example of how a client could make token auth seamless for an environment like OpenStack.
Yeah, I had some concerns with the way that it does the transport stuff actually. So so the current way that all the client auth plugins work is that they sort of wrap a transport down lower, which means that like a Go HTTP transport. And the way that this does it is it sends the request off, and then if it gets a forbidden error, then it goes and tries to refresh the token and then resends the request, which seems like a very weird abuse of that particular Go interface. It's like specifically denied by, it's specifically, in the documentation, it specifically says, do not do this. So there's a degree of like, I don't know, like, does we need to think about how we're doing the client auth stuff for plugins that don't have a native way of saying, looking at a token and saying, is this a valid token?
Yeah, so a couple things come to mind. One is that this, like wrapping a transport and doing something when you get a 401 back, seems like a really common pattern that would be good if every auth plugin didn't have to implement themselves.
Yeah.
So we might want to look at doing some of that work on behalf of auth plugins and having hooks where we can call them and say, hey, we got a 401, you probably need to go get a new token, try to get a new token now.
Yeah.
And then we can handle that in a consistent way across all the auth plugins. So that might be something to look at.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely, if you want to comment on that, or maybe you already did.
I did.
You have experience on the transport stuff for an auth provider. So yeah, feedback on there would be good.
Yeah, I'll follow back up on the thing.
Okay. All right. Eric, do you want to talk about the CIS benchmark?
Yeah, so the CIS Kubernetes benchmark stuff is basically the Center for Internet Security puts out these benchmarks. They've done one for Docker and various other things. There's been a lot of activity in that particular, in the benchmark. So I can maybe just share my screen even here. Am I allowed to take over from you? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, there's been a ton of work done. This website maybe doesn't have the best UI, but if you see at the bottom left, there's been a ton of work done in terms of like addressing specific flags that you need to set on the API server, on the scheduler, on the controller manager, et cetera, et cetera. I don't necessarily want to go into any of these individual ones, but just as a quick note, the timeline for this is about 6 to 8 weeks. I personally have not been spending quite as much time as I maybe should on this, but it seems to align very closely with some of the work that SIG Auth is doing around talking about attack vectors and more holistic views of what the general overall security looks like for a Kubernetes cluster. There are an insane amount of tickets from what I can see. So because this is going to be sent out by the Center for Internet Security, I think it'd be very good if some people from SIG Auth could come in and who are opinionated about this stuff, just to ensure that that this recommendation is going to be hitting all the bases. So again, I don't have any specific ones that I want to talk about in this meeting, but just a heads up that the timeline is about 6 to 8 weeks for this to be about complete.
Okay. Eric, are you saying that if there's a large number of tickets and there's a deadline and the tickets don't get handled well, that the benchmark might reflect poorly on the project? Is that a risk?
Not necessarily. I think the number of tickets just reflects how many aspects there are to the little niches that we know about the flags that need to be set to particular variables and stuff like that. I don't have any specific concerns around this going out and reflecting poorly on Kubernetes, but I think that people in SIG Auth definitely know a lot of the sort of smaller little details that people need to get right in Kubernetes clusters. And it would be good if we applied some of this effort to maybe even just scan over and make sure that particular flags are set to the correct variables, or little the small details are gotten right.
I think we just want to make sure the recommendations that are being made have been sanity checked. Also, the number of tickets, like that's tickets across all CIS projects. That's not just the Kubernetes CIS.
I'm still working on.
Yeah, that scared me the first time I
yeah.
on that too.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you for correcting me, Liggett.
Yep.
Okay.
So if you're interested, I think the instructions to join to get access are in that forum post, and yeah, definitely take a look. And if you see something that you disagree with, speak up. I mean, I think the process is intended to be like consensus driven. So people who know the area give their opinions, and like most things, there are trade-offs, right? Like if you want this feature, you need this setting, and this has implications whether it's on or off. And so the more information we can provide, the better informed people can be when they're trying to apply these. They can say, if I want to be super secure, I'm going to disable everything. But if I want this feature, I can enable this, and these are the implications. Like we just want to make that clear for people. Thanks, Eric. Eric, dude, you're up.
Hey, this is a business item. Currently, there are 4 SIG leads, and I'm listed as one of them. However, I spend almost all my time on apps and things other than auth. So in spirit of good community membership and having leads reflect what they're actually doing, I'm going to announce that I'll step down as a SIG lead, so that the list of leads will reflect who actually does work. I noticed that there's not a specific number of leads that's required for a SIG, and 3 seems to be the modal number. So I don't see any reason we need to seek a replacement at this time. But I leave that final decision to the remaining leads. Thanks. That's it.
Thanks, Eric. I know you had a lot of input early on, and you have as much input now as we can steal of your time. So we appreciate it. And yeah, definitely weigh in if you see things that are needed or concern you or you want.
Of course. And
happy to take your wish list.
Thank you very much.
All right. And just to follow up on that, I think Eric and David and I will talk it over. If people think that we could use more leads, that feedback would be helpful. If people are happy with how things are going and just want to get stuff done, that's helpful to know as well. We really want to have enough people to share the load and not so many that it becomes crazy. So yeah, we'll talk it over. If you have thoughts, feel free to shoot them out to the list, but we appreciate it. Well, we got through that far more efficiently than I expected. So we actually have some time left. Are there other issues or questions that people have, or feedback on the past release? Anything people want to talk about? It's Wednesday afternoon and people are tired. Okay. Well, we can call it and get some time back. And yeah, if other things come up, shoot them out to the list. And I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Have a good one.